Start sharing the screen. Okay, let me say welcome everybody, and I'm Nick, and
I'm Nathalie.
So let's go straight into the screen sharing. Well, actually, no, not straight, because I need to do the opening up first. So Nathalie, you have to remind me when I'm supposed to be moving forward.
Yeah, I still, yeah, okay, downloading now. Okay, so hi everyone. Today we give you hopefully brief, well, this is more like a whistle stop tour on reflective practice, and autoethnography. There goes a tongue breaker. So let's dive in right away. So with the question, why does anyone reflect anyway? And what I really liked, that summary of it, is to make the tacit explicit. That means when we teach, when we develop our practice, we grow a whole host of tacit knowledge of things that are just implied. And reflective practice encourages us to think about that again, to take that step back and look over our own shoulder into what that actually is we are doing. So yeah, next slide, thank you. And so there is a difference between reflective writing versus reflexive writing. So the baseline for reflective writing is becoming aware of one's own experiences and action. We often would relate that to existing literature and discussing this critically. So quite often in our subtle blog, for instance, a lot of this is reflective practice, where people share their practice, the reading behind it, their thinking processes, and the conclusions they have come to at that point in time. Reflexive writing takes this a little bit further. So in reflexive writing, we are really looking more into the context. We are also looking into our personal history and development and how this influences our thinking, our actions, and also it includes the implementation of that learning. So what have we learned from that reflective reflection on things, and how do we implement that into our practice? How do we change our practice? Yeah, thank you. So I found two really good quotes in a Jenny Moon book from 2004. And what I like here is that the critique of reflection is that the primary focus of reflection is on process issues. So it focuses on knowledge that is primarily confined to the application of theory into practice. So an example, for instance, would be to say, you want to implement whatever problem-based learning in your practice, and you've done some extensive literature review, you found it's been applied successfully across your discipline, and it comes with a really good roadmap on how to implement it. And then you might want to share your experience, and that is a reflection of the implementation. However, in reflexive practice, in the next slide, thank you.
Sorry, can I just say, I think there is some automation happening here that was never meant to be happening with the way it moves forwards and backwards.
No, oh, it might be on a play thing, yeah. So in reflexivity, we take that step further and we actually interrogate the things we have taken for granted, the assumptions we are making. So for instance, the implementation of problem-based learning, well, it's quite common to do this, for instance, in medical education. In reflexive practice, we actually ask ourselves the why. Why are we doing this? What assumptions are we making of our teaching situation, of our learners? It also helps us to be much more inclusive, because it encourages us to question assumptions we are making about our learners, about what we think our learners need, and to really take this more apart and really interrogate our decision-making process and the assumptions that are in our decision-making processes. And that, I think, is quite critical, a critical aspect to take into consideration with that. Now we can move on. Yeah, awesome. So one of the things, and Nick is going to tell you a lot about autoethnography, so I'm just having the segue to it. One of the things we are often asked is, well, what's the difference then between autoethnography and reflexive writing, right? And so in reflexive writing, we are talking about our own experiences. In autoethnography, we as the author, the person who's undertaking the educational inquiry, become also the subject, and the writing becomes the data. So we are not using the writing as is, or in most of the autoethnographies, I should add, but the writing actually becomes data and then is analyzed. And maybe in the next slide, Nick, before I hand over to you. So this will not make a lot of sense to you at the moment. So I took a sketch note from a webinar, and the link to the webinar and the link to the blog that actually explains this sketch note in words is in the notes of that particular slide. So I was attending a webinar by Tony Adams, and he was talking about the art of autoethnography, which I really enjoyed. And I think there are two things that I really liked in his explanation. So the first was that he considers autoethnography both a process and a craft. And he's talking about that we have to think and research like an ethnographer, but write like a novelist. And the two key messages are in the next slide I wanted to share with you, which I really like when thinking about autoethnography, is that we are writing through the I for the other. So we are using our perspective and experience so that others can learn from our learning, from our perspectives, and apply that to their own practice. And the other thing is autoethnography begins with a personal story, which I quite like because it's an easy way to write, at least for me. So that's why I enjoyed it. And I am handing over to Nick, who's going into more detail about the different types of autoethnography. And I think you also said something about ethics.
I do indeed. Right, so I actually used autoethnography quite extensively, and it is a big part of my PhD. So done a lot of work into it, and I think it's fascinating. First of all, because there will probably be quite a few people who say, oh, what's this navel gazing all about? Because you basically write just about yourself, and yet you don't. So the whole word, and the lovely portmanteau, so it's a personal experience, because you're talking about yourself, about what you're thinking, your reflections, your reflexiveness, but you do that in order to understand the wider social context, because you can only ever write within your own cultural experience and your social circumstances. So you look at the wider context by writing autoethnographically. So when researchers do autoethnography, you will be writing about, perhaps, retrospectively, you will be writing about experiences, about feelings, about thoughts, about situations that happen. So it's not so much, well, it can be, but it's usually not so much about writing reflection in practice. So basically, it's not so much about writing in the moment. It tends to happen afterwards, but it can also be in the moment, because you're not tethered to one way of writing. So there are different approaches to writing that you can take. And all of that you do is because you are being part of a culture. So when I write about experiences that might refer to something that happens in the now, that could be maybe teaching somebody, or teaching let's take something from my actual experience. Teaching a large group of people from Azerbaijan. That was a few years ago at another institution, and they were all mature students. Now, the way I was teaching and the way I was thinking about the teaching was all embedded within my own cultural experience. And that includes not just my own cultural personal experience and where I'm from, but also my academically cultural experience, which totally clashed actually with the people I was teaching, because they had a very, very different cultural experience of academia, of being taught, of who they were. Later on, I actually found out that several of the people couldn't understand the word I was saying because they didn't understand English, but because they were related to the people in power in their home country, they were part of that group. So when I was then reflecting on that and writing about it, I think you get really into the depth of it while you were making assumptions, why we all are, the academia, the academy, whatever, is making assumptions, and then kind of base that within your own understanding and also the literature. So it can go far, far deeper than many other approaches, but it is about the eye. So, and Nathalie mentioned it already. And there's a difference, of course, between data collection and data generation. And what autoethnography does, or any kind of way of creating data like reflection, is what you generate the data. So in autoethnography in particular, the data source, you, and the researcher, you, are actually one and the same. Quite different to when you're collecting the data, even though, of course, this is why this puzzle piece is not quite separate, because you're the one who chooses questions, you're the one who sets up the methodology, the methods, and the approaches. And because of that, because you generate the data, there are different ways of undertaking autoethnography. I'll give you some example though before that. So this is the example of data generation from my own research. And I mentioned before the different ways of doing that. So the data generation tends to be more structured, more, I wouldn't say formalized, no, because the writing itself isn't, but more structured. And if you undertake a piece of autoethnography, you don't randomly write here and there. You have to think about, you have to make sure that there are certain approaches to it. You might want to write journaling, you might want to write diaries, you might want to do other things, but they are more structured than willy-nilly. So what I did, for example, I generated data from reflections that were related to keywords and from literature. I also wrote analytic memos, and that had to do with the constructivist kind of theory approach I was taking. And yet, when you create analytic memos during coding, during analysis, that is data, and you can use that data to be analyzed as well. I did spontaneous journaling, but again, it was a bit more formalized because it was related to artifact creation. So it was kind of reflection on the creation, but then, as you can imagine, when you go to more spontaneous journaling, so you basically start free writing, you veer off. And that is fascinating because you probably won't know at the start why you end up talking about something at the end. So you can take autoethnographic field notes, etc. So there are many different ways of doing that. And all of the data that you generate is valid. And I think that is an important point to take, because we all tend to hold ourselves back when we're trying to write academically. And that's not necessary when you're generating this data. In fact, you shouldn't, because you want to be able to really dig deep. So different autoethnographies. Now, even though autoethnography has been undertaken since the 1980s, it is not as established as many other approaches to qualitative research. I sometimes wonder if that goes back to the whole, but that's just navel gazing thing. But it also might simply have to do with the way, depending on your subject discipline background, the way you were brought up within academia to think. And I can tell you, and I can tell you freely, the one that I'm going for, because I admit it, I have difficulties with evocative autoethnography. And that does not mean that it doesn't have a place. In fact, the best known approach to autoethnography is evocative autoethnography. But what it does, as it says here, it aims to evoke emotional responses in the reader. And often it doesn't have an analysis. It is just the text, or the text that has been put together using all the data that was generated. It exists, it is accepted. Personally, I kind of start yelling, where's the analysis? So not my kind of thing. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. Now, the other end of the extreme, because really there are two extremes, and there's really a bit of a slider going in. I wish I had found a slider that was all the way to one side, but that's analytical autoethnography. And while I very much agree with Anderson here, and that's the researcher is a full member of the research group or setting, visible as such a member in the researcher's published text. So you are making sure you have to be explicit in who was part of that, who kind of that this is generated through you, and committed to the analytical research agenda, usual thing. But where this one is more to the other extreme is because you see the first bit is a full member in the research group or setting, where basically it goes so far away from the evocative autoethnography that it just looks at, well, you can't just generate data while doing something for yourself. You have to be part of a research group or setting. So almost, or rather similar to being within a focus group while you're running the focus group, well, not quite, but a bit like that. Now, in some of the critiques on that, they called this neo-realist. And to this day, I'm not quite sure what exactly they meant, because, well, I mean, there is, of course, the idea of realism, but neo-realist tends to refer to what, international politics or something? Anyway, so I think rather what is meant here is that there is too much of an attempt to put yourself, even though you're part of that, as separate from the data, almost a bit like you could kind of be neutral in that somehow. So it's very much on an extreme. Again, I would say, well, that's not quite possible. And also, I don't agree with saying that it's either that or the other. Fortunately, I am certainly not the only one who doesn't think so, because here we are in moderate autoethnography. I mean, it was time that somebody basically came up with that. And Schalkeval is an excellent paper. And by the way, just before you ask, all of the references and more are actually in the in this slide deck that will be sent out to you, because I think it is important that if you do want to go for autoethnography, and if you want to do a piece of scholarship or research, whatever, with autoethnography, to actually look at the whole spectrum and decide for yourself and justify why it is that you're approaching the autoethnography in a specific way. So I hope they've got up. Yes. So the way then I took towards moderate autoethnography is that, yes, I did go for the research-centered approach, and that's really the core of the evocative autoethnography, because I do not agree that you can only do autoethnography if you are part of a formal research group setting. But also I put a lot of emphasis on the analysis of the data. In fact, I treat the data that I generated like any other qualitative data. And I went and I did coding of the qualitative data. I mean, it wasn't thematic coding, it was line by line coding, initial coding, but that doesn't matter. I quite simply treated the data that I generated as data. I would have never just left it. As I said, I'm not an evocative autoethnography person, but neither do I believe in the other side. So And what came out of this data very much is in line with what we said earlier, and that is this data is far more about the cultural context and what's happening around, what's happening in the past, kind of the culture that I grew up in, the culture that exists in now, the culture that is also reflecting without even meaning to on literature, etc. So just checking the chat. Yeah. Yes, autobiographical versus evocative writing. That's an interesting one. We can discuss that in a sec. So you might wonder now, well, what about ethics? And that is indeed a very interesting thing, and it hasn't been fully decided yet, and I don't think it ever will. There are guidelines, and Alice, famous evocative autoethnographer, geez, I'm quite fast in saying that now, is actually the person they've really been working on those guidelines, and they call it relational ethics, which really does make a lot of sense because you will be talking about people in your writing. It goes back to the social context, but also to the fact that nobody can exist without other people. So you will be writing about other people, and depending on the subject matter that is being investigated, that could have quite a few issues. Now, an example that Alice is giving is an autoethnography that was written about sexual abuse. As you can imagine, I don't need to say more on that one other than that a lot of that data was extremely personal, confidential, but not personal, but talking about other people. So that particular person that's being mentioned there actually did write an evocative autoethnography, which maybe I can understand on this subject, but anyway, there were quite a few issues with that because they were talking about other people, perpetrators. And considering who the author is, it was then actually possible to potentially find out the people they were talking about. So what do you do then? Maybe in this extreme example, they were not able or were not willing to gain consent from other people. I don't think they ever kind of quite decided that, but anyway, they were then rewriting things a bit more that it wasn't quite so obvious. So what Alice is saying is that should you be writing an evocative autoethnography, you need to gain consent from the people that you're talking about. And I have to agree with that very much here, because you would never, it would be unethical to write about other people without them knowing and potentially saying things that are very confidential to them. However, and certainly with my own data that I generated, yes, of course, I was also writing about other people. I did make the decision of not sharing the raw data. My supervisors had the access to it. They got a little bit of an example, said, no, that's perfectly fine. Because it was personal, but because it's being analyzed, because I treated the data as normal data and I analyzed it and I coded it, I was deconstructing the data, I was breaking up the data. So actually, there is nothing that really relates to people I'm talking about any longer. So when you are writing, so I would, and now I think we need to discuss that with Nathalie as well, because she knows so much more about ethics. But example, I did not actually have to go for ethics approval for the data that I generated. But that was because I could say, that the data will be just analyzed like that. In retrospect, I'm now wondering, I wonder if maybe, anyway, in retrospect, I'm wondering if I should have, and just for the institution to say, that's okay, you don't need to do that. And personally, I would say that you should. This is now my opinion now, that you should go and fill in an ethics application, even if it is to say, no, you don't actually need to do anything. So Nathalie, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with this. So my advice usually tends to be the moment you generate data and analyzing your own writing, what you did with the coding, and so you are making yourself a subject. And in that case, applying for ethics actually is not just to protect others, which you may or may not reference to in your autoethnography, but it's also to protect yourself. So, right, so going for the ethics application, it's not just about, it's not a tick box exercise to jump through hoops. It is actually supposed to be a means of looking at what you're doing and making sure that both your subjects and the researcher are protected. And in this case, in autoethnography, you're both, which makes it potentially actually more tricky to navigate. So usually what I say, if you write reflective and reflexive practice, where you're not going much in depth, which is almost like a literature review in reference with some of your thinking about your practice, you don't need ethics unless you have maybe collected some data or even just some sound bites from your students you want to use, and then you immediately need ethics approval because you're using data from someone else, even if it is low risk data, even if it is something that may have been covered by the data sharing agreement students sign when they enter any institution in the UK. However, that data sharing agreement is that way, that form of consent is still different from what an ethics application is. So don't get that muddled up. So the ethics application, the ethics approval is different from the consent from your students. So your students may just as well tell you, oh yeah, I'm happy for you to use my sound bites in your writing. You still need ethics approval for that, because just as even as an assurance to yourself that what you are doing is okay, that you are getting that peer feedback from others that say, yes, that's done proper, the data collection, the data analysis, the data storage, all of that is done in the appropriate way. Sorry, Nick, did you want to add something?
No, just as an example, because I was thinking, so years ago, in another institution, when I undertook the their PG Cub, I had to have one assignment which was about reflections on an analysis of a very uncomfortable situation. And one of those critical incidents things. And I'm just now thinking, so I was then reflecting on a terrible situation, basically, where I ran one session. I was relatively early on in teaching, and it was so bad that I actually, when I got people to finally do something, I ran out of the room into the office of a colleague and went, oh my God, this is terrible, this is not working, and ran back out again because I just needed to tell somebody. But it was all very well for the assignment and then reflect on it, etc. But if I had used that, these kind of thoughts, these reflections to do something scholarly, then not just for the obvious reasons I should have gone through data, through ethics application, but I think it would have helped me to really think about what it means when you start reflecting on a situation like that. And of course, also I was reflecting and thinking and writing about individuals and their behavior and why it was so awful and why they were so obstructive and all of that, and my own emotional reaction to it. So yes, I would say always go for it.
Obviously, if you want to publish about it, then go for ethics. You know, if it's notes for yourself, then you don't need ethics. But if you plan on dissemination and on publication, which is the whole point of SOTL, is, you know, one of the biggest aspects of SOTL projects is to share, you know, and to publish, or in any way, shape or form. It can be a blog post, can be a podcast, can be a journal article, you know, but it is that, you know, you need to share it. And then you definitely need the ethics approval, absolutely.
So before we finish in the sharing, I just wanted to show you that we do have indeed all these references. You know, we've got all the important ones from Anderson and Ellis, etc., but also Starke Wall. Starke is, hang on, S-Wall, Starke Wall, oh, Starke Wall. Well, are there two different people? Are there two different people, Nathalie? That's an interesting one. So, so anyway, so you've got all of that in there.
I think it's Starker and Wall, I think.
Oh, well. There we go. We need to check that one.
Figure it out.
But anyway, I also added Ingold because he's actually critical of autoethnography, because I think that, that's obviously important that we also look at the critical voices. However, there are many critical voices when it comes to that anyway, but it needs to be up to you what your feeling is about it, how useful it is. As you can imagine, both Nathalie and I think that it can be very useful depending on the area you're investigating and depending on the questions you're asking. So we say thank you very much, and now open to question. We have plenty of time.
If people need a moment to think, I would actually be really, that just popped into my mind when you were talking, Nick, was that, well, what's the difference then between autobiographical writing and evocative ethnography? Because I'm like, oh,
I don't know. I've often wondered about that, but then I don't know enough about autobiographical writing.
Yeah.
Well, they're both subjective. They both involve recreation of a history, probably. I would say maybe evocative writing in the academic sense is more concerned with intertextuality and positionality, I guess, in an attentive way than maybe autobiographical work is. But yes, it seems there's potentially a weird overlap there.
I wonder if it's also to do with the learning from aspect as well, whereas you can get autobiographical, which is intended to be informative perhaps and creative, but with the autoethnography, there's that intention to learn from, and for others to learn from, and for you to learn from those reflections. So there might be that slight difference.
Yeah.
I wonder if autoethnography is more about a subject, because you're focusing on a specific area or a subject or a question or a problem or whatever it is. Well, maybe autobiographical writing might be more about my life. And I mean, my only experience with them is all these many churned out celebrity books or things. And I don't know, is there something else? I don't know. I've never read them. I don't want to read them. But I don't even read evocative autoethnography. So I just wonder if one's more focused on something than the other.
Yeah, possibly. I think Jenya had a good point with the positionality. Maybe that's the key difference. And
it's also where the risk is, I guess. Like when you think about, I guess, in practical terms, the ethics of doing autoethnography. I'm thinking about, I don't know if you would have read this, but it's a pretty, I think, famous example of the pitfalls of autoethnography. Elizabeth Dauphinet's The Politics of Exile is a pretty famous book, at least in kind of international relationships, about the problem of doing kind of collaborative autoethnography with your subject and the ways in which that can bleed in a dangerous way that maybe in autobiography, because you're only concerned with yourself as a subject, maybe you run less of that risk.
Has anybody undertaken something autoethnographical?
Is anyone planning to? Or maybe?
I have. I'm in a process, and I contacted Nathalie a while ago, asking about that, because the ethics of I'm doing dual ethnography with a colleague from another institution, and my context is fairly small. So in terms of ethics, if I inevitably discuss my positionality or experience, it would be really difficult not to, it's about anonymity and protection of others, as well as, and thanks to Nathalie's, the Stalker's text, I think it was also about protecting yourself, things that I have perhaps not considered myself before I've started. I was really concerned initially with how do I anonymize? It's a small context. If I say my manager, all you need to do is Google and you will know. I've only ever worked in the context when I worked, our histories are kind of written on the pages of our institutions. So you can see perhaps, by publications and engagement with SOTO where I've been before, or I haven't. So it's very kind of a small knit community. And I was concerned initially with, what if I just really want to say X, Y, Z about this this situation where I was in, or that thing that I've experienced, or that situation. But as in Autoethnography, you speak with another, and that's a fantastic way of adding that reflexivity, and that other person adding on their interpretation of what you're saying and your experience. And there is that kind of critical friend who can help out and give a different way of looking at what happened to you, not to persuade you, but just to offer a different view. And as we've kind of moved on, it seemed quite clear that it's less about, it's not that we were going towards saying things that may hurt others, but it was a lot of it was very, very personal, very transformational, I would say, but a lot of it was very personal. And we got to the stage now about almost that we really need to think about also protecting self as well as the other in a dual and others. And that engagement with ethics really, really helped me, because I'm in the same project. It's a chapter in a book collection, and there is another autoethnography project, multi autoethnographies, and this team are in Canada. They're based in Canada, and they're not going for ethics. And I kind of insisted that my partner and I go for ethics, kind of on advice of Nathalie's, and I benefited from that, thinking about it, thinking about others, reading about it, thinking how we analyze data, and then protecting self, other, or the other in the process, and others. It really helped me.
Yes, I thanks so much for that. And that's really, I think it's really helpful. And as I said before, in retrospect, I'm thinking now I should have, and I kind of almost wish that it was a different institution, different setup, and all of that. So they didn't expect me to. But I like what you're saying about the self. So I remember that quite a lot of reflections are kind of reflections on kind of key literary issues actually ended up in kind of childhood experiences. And that if I were interviewing somebody, I would absolutely need ethics and also support structures, because that could be potentially very uncomfortable, disturbing, etc. But of course, you don't do it for yourself, because I know it's just me. I just think about these things, and that's fine. But it isn't. So I think as part of a project, to actually being able to say, and this is how I approached it for myself, others, etc., would make the whole project better. And just I use the word again, deeper.
I also would maybe add is, what you just said, Nick, with it's just myself. It actually isn't, particularly when we think about education inquiries, and when we think about writing about ourselves in a teaching situation, that is identity negotiation. We are thinking about who we are, who we have become, and that can be quite personal, and it can feel at times maybe like risk-taking, particularly depending on what your experiences in that process of becoming have been, and they may not always have been positive, and so that element of protecting yourself and how much you share, or maybe in what way you share it, is worthwhile thinking about it. And I think that ethics process actually asks you to think about that as well, and that kind of staying safe, and yet being able to share in that context.
It's interesting that you mentioned your worry about really free writing. Ivona, when you mentioned potentially talking about your manager. And
sorry, I didn't, there is nothing.
No. I mean,
full
disclosure.
But it was that was my worry at the beginning, because it
Yes.
is about teacher identity, it was about development. So it necessarily, you talk about structures, not as a kind of a person, but as a position.
No. I didn't mean that you were talking about your manager. Sorry, I just realized that's what it sounded like. No, but what I mean with that is that if I had ever thought at the very beginning, and I mean, I started creating the data back in 2016, so it's been a while ago, but if I had thought at the beginning that I might have to write something that might then be out there in any way, shape or form, I would never have written what I wrote. So feeling that the data is safe because it is mine and I'm writing it down at the beginning made all the difference. So yeah, just as a, see, I never expected to undertake an autoethnography. I can't even remember how on earth I got into it. But it's, yeah, the more I was doing, the more I was reading, and maybe back to it, the more I was doing it, the more I realized that it is about the context, because you can't say anything about yourself without also saying something about the wider context.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is what makes it really difficult, where you need to be very, very careful when you're writing a piece of reflective practice or reflexive practice to leave others out, even if you think, oh, I'm just saying that, that my students really laughed, or maybe write one student comment in. At that point, you are using data, you are using someone else's experience, reactions, behavior in a situation. So, and in reflective practices, it's really just about you in that situation without referencing to others' interaction with you in that place. And I think this is kind of maybe the most important thing to take into consideration when you write, and to know at which point you need ethics is literally when you ask for someone else's perspective as well. So beyond that, what we talked about, the protection of the self, is the moment you bring in other people, you bring in other people's experiences, data, comment, behavior, that is when you need to apply for ethics. Does have anyone questions in terms of any of the things we actually talked about, or how to collect the data, or what to do with it, or yeah.
I had questions about analysis, kind of different cycles. I've attended Nick's session on analysis before, but I was just wondering, now that I'm in the process, whether you could maybe just give us some ideas of sort of different ways you can analyze, and kind of which combinations can go nicely together as well. Thanks.
Well, I think it all goes back to what your question is, if you have a question, or what the area is that you're investigating. The best known analysis of qualitative data, of course, is thematic analysis, coding. But even for even if you say, oh, I'm undertaking some thematic analysis, or there are so many different ways of doing so, there are, I think, a couple of really well-known ones that if you just go into any kind of, if you Google thematic analysis, you will always come across them. And of course, while I was saying that, I can't remember the names, but maybe Janice or Nathalie can. Then, of course, coding can be done in all sorts of different ways. I can always highly recommend Saldana, and the latest edition of the handbook for qualitative data analysis is available as an ebook. So we have that, hooray. But because I was undertaking a constructivist grounded theory, and that data that I generated was kind of the first set of data, I did the analysis according to quite formal ways that I mentioned, the line by line coding. I mentioned the initial coding, then the cycles, and the second cycle, and the focus coding, etc. So the data that you generate in autoethnography, you can use in any kind of wider approach. It can be just in a smaller piece of scholarship, or it can be in a much, much bigger research piece. It can be part of the data that you have. So for example, my second set of data, when I did the theoretical sampling, after I had the categorization done from the autoethnographic one, was done with narrative interviews. And that's fine, because you can mix the data. And this is, to me, this is what methodology is. It is a strategy. And it's up to you. It's a bit like, don't want to say smorgasbord, but I always look at it as a mosaic, because you can put things together in the way that fits best. It doesn't have to be something that is tried and trusted. That's how you do it, and you can't deviate, as long as you can justify why you're doing it and how that is actually answering questions or investigating areas, etc. However, I'm handing over to other of my colleagues who have a lot of experience with that. Nathalie first.
I was just because I can't remember all the different types either, and as I just Googled quickly, and the first thing I found is like coding reliability thematic analysis, codebook thematic analysis, reflexive thematic analysis, and I assume that just scrapes the surface. I think something that you might find really interesting, Sarah, you probably have the link. We had a webinar earlier in the year, Sarah organized with a researcher who has interpreted data and analyzed data through song and voice artistry, and I think that's really interesting as well. And I've actually had discussions with another colleague, and we are looking into this, using blackout poetry for data analysis. So you can actually literally be as creative as possible. So blackout poetry, I don't know if you know that, you use some text and you start, identifying words that stick out, and then you black out the rest of the text. And then from the words that are left over, you create a poem, which is used for instance, teaching translation studies. It can be used for computer coding. It can be used for all kinds of things. But it encourages really in-depth engagement with text, mainly written text. And I think you can actually use it for data analysis, because it really forces you to think about what you're reading and to identify what are the things that stick out on it. And then you use the words that are left to make sense. Yeah, Simone's webinar, thank you, Sarah. So Sarah posted that in the comments. That would be something that might interest you in terms of looking into a completely different way of handling data. Yeah, I don't know if Janice or Sarah want to add anything more.
I can come in just for a moment, but I wasn't thinking I would be talking about my own analysis. Just before I do, was it Braun and Clark you were thinking of, Nick?
Yes, thank you.
So Braun and Clark, I'll put it in the chat just when I'm finished talking, 2006, they've got an article on thematic
other
analysis.
ones, Ryan and something, I think.
Yes, and I can't remember that one, but yes. So that's a kind of step-by-step to thematic coding that you're probably all familiar with. I suppose I would agree with what Nick's saying, in that you've got a set of data there, so it's whatever. My own experiences with life story, and with that one, your focus is more on the sort of the actors and the plot, and you're kind of writing around timelines and thinking about why things happen in a particular way, why people make the decisions that they do at particular points in time. Thanks, Sarah. So that's something else, depending on your purpose and what you've got in your data, is to look at it in terms of a kind of chronological, almost kind of life story. And of course, a subset of that would be life history, where you start to put it into the historical context as well.
Never done that. I do think it sounds absolutely fascinating, especially the life history bit. I was also suddenly remembered one of the things, because I felt, and I'm only saying I felt, right, because this is very, very personal data that you generated now, and because I had to do this line by line coding. Now, the line by line coding is completely arbitrary, because what you literally do, you pop it into a document, and whatever the line is the line. It's not about sentences. As you can imagine, there have been enough researchers who say, that's deconstructing too much because you lose the meaning. Others say, no, actually, we're deconstructing it that much. You find, no, not find. Hang on, sorry. That's very important. Themes do not emerge. You construct them. So it's right here at my desk. So it's the same with that, because you construct more out of the data. However, I felt I really went with those people who said deconstructing can actually give you more, because it is my own data, because it was just my own data. I felt by deconstructing the data, I was able to take a completely different look at it, and it was true. I did. Had I gone in and coding with a classic one, descriptive coding by maybe sentence or whatever, I am not sure I would have been able to elevate the data analytically. I wonder if I just stuck to exactly what I'd said before. So that's just one of the things that I felt while doing that. Even though I can tell you one thing, when you start doing this weird line by line coding first, it's very, very odd. It took me a long time to get into it.
I did a traditional way of kind of like highlighting things that I thought were similar, were under a similar topic, and then clustered them together. And I got lost with NVivo, so I ended up cutting things out and putting them together and shuffling them around. But one of the things I actually also did was when I came out of fieldwork, so I did ethnography. When I came out of fieldwork, I sometimes actually wrote a poem from first impressions, you know, from the first, like, all the things you've been taken in and you've been thinking about. And I didn't know how to express them I didn't know how to express them in a different way. So I ended up with writing poetry because that worked for me. But yeah, I was a bit too much out there at the time, I think.
Or the Alison, the wonderful session that Alison ran, CPD session on the collage, that as an approach. So it really, I had to learn throughout my life and career, whatever, that it is okay to be creative and to take different approaches. Now, my initial postgrad was actually in historical linguistics. So you can imagine that was back in the 80s and 90s, and that's how you did things, full stop. It took a very long time to accept that by doing things like the wonderful blackout poetry that you just mentioned, Nathalie, or by undertaking a collage as an approach to scholarship, that is okay. So,
and if you are talking about decolonizing research and meaning making and knowledge creation, you know, stepping back from ways of this, there is only one way to create knowledge. There's only one way to accept a creation of a, well, constructed truth most often in our, you know, and that's challenging it and enabling students, enabling us, enabling colleagues to find a way to create that knowledge, to negotiate it, to share it in a way that is meaningful to them and it is meaningful to others as well. So yeah, that's what we.
Rich pictures is another approach which comes out of computing sciences, which is used to generate data. Well, the data that you generate is actually rich pictures, is images, which is done within groups. And I find that more and more, and that is, I think, a change that has been happening in the last, maybe even just 10 years, is that any kind of a slightly different way of approaching things actually has peer-reviewed literature on it. And with me, with the age I am and my background, I'm very glad of that, because I need, and probably will for the rest of my life, need the support of proper peer-reviewed literature behind it that says it's okay, you can do that, you're not just doodling around like a little child. But yeah, and I think autoethnography is actually really, really a step in the right direction. It gives you, I found it quite freeing actually, to consider that my thoughts, experiences, feelings, whatever, are not just navel gazing, but actually when I analyzed it, some very interesting things regarding to cultural context, regarding to approaches to that had to do with my specific research area that I would have never thought about otherwise. And then was able to do sampling and interview others, taking that as a foundation. Right.
Conscious of time, we have 3 minutes to. Yeah. Any last words, questions, comments?
Well, if not, then I do hope that you've enjoyed it and maybe had some interesting ideas, or are going out and do your autoethnography, being a reflexive thinker. Oh, that is so difficult.
And you can always get in touch if you have any questions, if you want to discuss it. You also know we have the Tasler network on MS Teams, so if there's anything you want to chat about, discuss, just get in touch and keep the conversation going. So
right, yes. Right. Okay, thanks everybody. See you.
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you.